Hi everybody, this is chapter 4, part 2, where we're going to get into animal research. So the first part of chapter 4, we talked about human subjects research, which is what you had your city training about. And now we're going to talk about animal research in terms of the ethics of doing animal research. So the first thing I want to ask is, what's an animal? So which one of these is not an animal? And I know that's not a fair question, but go ahead and answer. Now, of course, I'm not sure which one you chose or not. I'm assuming you probably chose a worm if you had to choose any. But the question might be confusing to you. You're saying, hey, which one of these is not an animal? That doesn't make any sense. Well, do you remember how we talked about with the human subjects that we had the common rule, which is the federal law regarding what constitutes research, what constitutes a human subject, what they have to do? Well, just like we had to define what a human subject is, we also have to define what an animal is. And this starts getting a little bit complicated when you look at the laws. So whatever your specific ethics or morality is, we're going to talk about what the federal law concerning animals happens to be. So there's two different federal laws that we might need to consider when we talk about what an animal is. So the first one is the Animal Welfare Act. Animal Welfare Act has to do with all animals, not just in research, just all animals in general. But in order to do that, then they got to determine what an animal is. So if you look at this particular one, so this has to do with pets, this has to do with what other animal, animals on farms, etc. So an animal means any living, dead, dog, cat, non-human primate, guinea pig, hamster, blah 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 blah, whatever animal which is being used or is intended for use for research, teaching, testing, experimentation, exhibition purposes, or as a pet. So, for example, when you look at this, there's a few things that you should note. It has to be a warm-blooded animal. So automatically, when you look at this list, according to the legal definition of what an animal is, when this is, by the way, a relatively broad definition, the USDA would not consider a crayfish or a worm to be an animal. A crayfish or a worm would not be an animal because they are not warm-blooded. Now, beyond that, the Animal Welfare Act looks at anything that's not used for research, teaching, testing, experimentation, or exhibition purposes, or as a pet. So, for example, if you have a pet rat, that's an animal. But if you have a rat in your basement, it's not an animal, according to the Animal Welfare Act, because it has to do with ethical treatment of animals, animal cruelty laws, etc. That's a little bit different than the PHS. PHS is the Public Health Service. The Public Health Service is the institution of the federal government that is most involved with animal research in places like a university, for example. According to PHS policy, all vertebrates are considered to be animals, and therefore, if you're doing research on any vertebrate, then you have to go through the protocols of animal research, animal subject research. Now you'll notice that in this particular case, those crayfish and the worms, they're not animals, and therefore they don't have to go through the ethical guidelines. Now, why is this a big deal? Well, this is a big deal because the PHS, the Public Health Service, as we'll see in a minute, has a committee that's like the IRB for humans, but for animal research, and therefore any animal that is not on that list is not considered. So anyone that's not a vertebrate wouldn't have to go through that same ethical process, right? So if you're doing research on worms, you don't have to go through that process of getting it passed through the ethics review. Beyond that, we also have a hierarchy. So this is, according to the NIH, this is a subdivision of the NIH. This is their definition of how we go through the ethics process of using animal subjects research. And this is a direct quote from them. So you should generally use the most appropriate and least sentient species capable of providing the data you need. The following is a typical hierarchy of sentient animal species. Non-human primates such as monkeys, marmosets, and baboons are at the top of the list. Then large animals such as cats, dogs, and pigs, then rabbits, then rodents, then non-mammalian vertebrates such as poultry, reptiles, fish. And if you remember, anything under that is not a actual animal according to the law. And so what this is saying is that if you're doing your research, you should use the lowest animal on the list. And so lowest, in this case, means lowest sentient. So it's saying that if you can do your research on a mouse, for example, then you shouldn't use rabbits to do it. You should use mice before you use rabbits. So these hierarchies actually tend to be a little bit different depending on what institution you're looking at. Here's another example of a hierarchy that we have. They generally fit in the same list though. So with apes and primates at the very top, then monkeys, larger animals that are kept as pets, larger animals that are farm animals, then rabbits, rodents, non-mammalian vertebrates, then you get into invertebrates and single-cell organisms from there. So there is a hierarchy as to what you should use, even when you do have the option to use an animal. You shouldn't use an orangutan when you could use a pig, for example. All right, we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go through some examples of animal research that is done. And I want you to tell me whether or not you feel it is or is not ethical. And then think about, while you're watching these, what would or would not make these things particularly ethical. As you're considering the different examples that we just went through, there are different things that you should be thinking about as to what is or is not ethical and why we do that. So, for example, if you look, some people have very strong feelings about ethics. For example, this is from PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, and their top 5 reasons for not using any animal testing at all. Other people are saying, well, what we're doing is important research, and if you remember, the Nuremberg Code was written explicitly so that humans would not be used as subjects when we could use animals for the same purpose. So what does this mean? Well, this means that for you, you need to figure out what you feel is ethical or not, in the same way that you need to figure out what is ethical or not for you for human subjects research as well. In terms of what an institution like the University of Colorado Boulder might consider ethical or not, they have to go through what is called an IACUC. So the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee is basically the same as an IRB, only for animals. They look at several different factors in terms of what makes it ethical. And there are very specific things that you've got to go through in terms of how you're going to house the animals, what you might use to sedate an animal if you needed to, what you might use to euthanize an animal once you're done with the research, etc. So all of these things are considered by the IACUC. So let's think about what the IACUC does and does not include. And one thing that you need to know about the IACUC is the 3 R's. The 3 R's: reduce, replace, refine. So the IACUC is required by federal law. That law is administered by the PHS, the Public Health Service, like we talked about before, to make sure that each institution that is using animals as subjects has an IACUC. And there's very specific things that they have to have, a veterinarian, et cetera, that makes the determination as to whether something is ethical. One of the main principles, guiding principles, remember how in the Belmont Report we have beneficence, justice, and respect for persons? Well, there's other principles as well for the IACUC, and those include the 3 R's: refine, reduce, and replace, right? So reduce is the easy one. It says you should use the minimal number of animals as necessary, so that they're trying to minimize just the widespread use willy-nilly of all the animals, and make sure that we're only using the lowest number of animals that we need to. So part of the application for for a research study that's given to the IACUC would say, here's the minimal number of animals, let's say it's rats, that we need, and why. Refinement means to be refining the procedures of how you interact with these animals. So refining procedures of housing, but also refining procedures of surgery, euthanasia, anesthetics, and also termination, meaning euthanasia, how the animal is killed when you're done with the study. if the animal is killed. There are the Public Health Service doesn't have a specific statement about whether or not you can adopt them as animals, et cetera. That's up to the individual institution, but there are specific guidelines of how to terminate an animal when they're done with the study. So we talked about refining. That was refining. Okay, reduce, reuse, refine, replace. All right. So we got not reuse. Sorry, that's recycling. So replace. Remember when we talked about that hierarchy of animals? So according to the IACUC needs to determine that you are using the lowest sentient animal that you can in order to get the study that you need. So for example, if you're doing something like a fairness study, then you probably aren't going to be able to use, um, I don't know, I gotta be careful what I say here. Maybe an insect for that. You would need to, instead of using cockroaches, you would have to use a higher order animal, and then you have to make the argument that you needed to use a primate like a monkey for that kind of a study. Beyond that, you can replace using non-animal methods. So computer modeling is a famous one now. So if you can, you do it with a computer model instead of using an animal, or using tissue from animals, or perhaps, and in some cases they use eggs or embryos of animals instead of the actual live animals themselves, which fall under different protocols and don't have the same, those, like an embryo, for example, doesn't have the same protection under these kind of acts. So the IACUC acts as if it was an IRB only for animal use. So let's take a look now at a study, and this is one that we mentioned in a previous time. This is a study that I looked at before. This was actually done by some colleagues of mine who ended up at the University of Maryland in College Park. So Farron Madison came and spoke with a class that I taught, a class on ethics and talked with them. Gregory Ball was the dean of our college later on. In this study, they take canaries, right, and they castrate the male canary. Then they inject male and female canaries with testosterone, and then, for at least some of them, they kill the canary and take its brain out and look at the actual brain to see what changes have happened, not only in behavior but also in the actual physical structure of the brain after this experience with testosterone. Now, there are obviously many feelings that people are going to have about a study like this, where you would castrate, inject, kill, and dissect something like a bird, right? When the IACUC looks at this, they have to determine whether or not there is a benefit to doing this study. And in this particular case, the IACUC, which at the time was at Johns Hopkins, if I'm not mistaken, Johns Hopkins University, determined that it was worth the knowledge of how hormones like testosterone would affect the structure of a brain, and also how that would change behaviorally for an animal that's a little more simple in its brain structure than a human. There are, therefore, when they go through this, they would have to know lots of different things, like how the animals would be housed, how they would be sedated during any form of surgery, how they would be killed, and what would happen in terms of any practices of surgery that would happen from there. So there are a lot of different things that would happen. Now, the ethical part of this has to do with whether or not there really is a benefit compared to the cost, not just for the animal, but for the amount of knowledge we as humans would be able to derive from it. Remember, the Nuremberg Code was written partially so that humans would be protected, and as humans are being protected, that means that animals would be used in their stead in order to make progress scientifically. So for this, I want you to keep in mind the things that we talked about: what an animal is, the 3 R's, what the IACUC does, and what would be the benefits or costs to any one of these kinds of studies. All right, thanks.